I don't know how to follow that. So here we go. Okay. My name's Cam Irvine. I'm going to gab at you guys for a little bit. And this is something that I find very interesting. So hopefully I don't throw up on myself right now. We're going to talk about inverted thinking. And before we do that, I've got a question for the group. So genuinely, go ahead and shout out any answers. But does anyone want to take a guess as to how many decisions you make in a day? Or how many decisions the average person makes? 24,000? 2,000? 6,000? 75,000? Wow, these are big numbers. 100 total or? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Nice. Good spread here. Okay. So I like that. That's meta. So the actual answer is 35,000 per day, on average. So if you add up all of those decisions, that comes out to a little bit under 13 million each year. So some decisions. A lot of those are subconscious and trivial. They might be things like, should I use this word or that word? Or maybe it's, who knows? Maybe I'll take a sip of my drink or I won't. But some of those decisions, at least some of them, are going to matter a little bit. And it might be something like, what's my next career move? Or how do I increase my level of happiness? Things like those. They tend to matter a little bit more. So because of the sheer amount of decisions that we make, if we can improve our decision making just a little bit, that can end up having a huge difference in our life. So that's why one way we can do that is through inverted thinking. So let's actually talk about that now, because it begs the question, what the hell is inverted thinking? Inverted thinking is a mental model. So it's basically a way of looking at a problem from a different perspective, and we actually consider the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. So it gives us a different point of view on how we think about things, and perspective matters. So put that another way, it's a way that we can think better by avoiding stupidity instead of trying to be brilliant at something. And I don't mean that in terms of stupidity like if you're like me and you're just a stupid person. What I actually mean is making decisions that can reduce mistakes. So the idea is we're not really trying to achieve a good outcome necessarily. The goal is more so to avoid a bad outcome instead. So it's a reframe. And chances are everybody's actually used inverted thinking at some point in their life. So on a multi-choice test, for example, we've probably all run into that. You read a question and then you realize, I don't know the answer here. So you're kind of left with a few options then. You can give up, not a great option. You can take a wild guess, or you can start to eliminate the answers that you know are wrong. And when you start to eliminate answers that you know are wrong, you're reducing the likelihood of getting that question wrong. Putting that another way, you're increasing your odds of getting it right. So technically, you might all already be experts in inversion thinking, so give yourself a round of applause for that. That's very well done. Good on you guys. So this gentleman here, he's 98 years old. Remember that. His name is Charlie Munger. Has anybody ever heard of him? Perfect. All right. So he's kind of a thought leader. He's a big proponent of mental models. He isn't super well known, but what he is most well known for is he's the business partner of Warren Buffett and the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, which is a pretty big company. And he's got a lot of funny quips and sayings, but there's one quote that I like in particular where he says, "All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there." And yeah, that's comical, but the idea is that that is actually inverted thinking. The idea is that if he knows the destination of where he's going to die, In theory, he can avoid that and stay alive together. Sorry, stay alive forever. Although also together. I mean, if you are alive, it goes both ways. 98 years old, remember. So it's worked so far, at least. And it's easy to think that stupidity and brilliant are opposites on a spectrum. So we see these as you are either one or the other. So they seem like they're two sides of the same coin. But if we use inversion thinking, we can actually separate these out and see that brilliance and stupidity, or actually avoiding stupidity, are separate scales altogether. So they're entirely independent and they don't have any crossover. So if we apply this in the terms of conventional thinking, we might want to strive to be brilliant. We want to be really good at things. I mean, it's a human drive. It's nestled very deep in our nature for a lot of us to want to be good at stuff. But inverted thinking looks at it from the other lens, which is, why don't we avoid stupidity? Why don't we try to reduce the number of mistakes that we make? And there's a gentleman by the name of Simon Ramo that wrote a book that nobody read, called Extraordinary Tennis for the Ordinary Player. Disclaimer, I don't play tennis, so yeah, let's move on. But what Ramo points out in this book is that there's two different types of tennis. There's that of professionals who win points, and there's that of amateurs who lose points. And so he goes on to explain how in a professional game of tennis, players are matched, nearly identical in skill, and they volley the ball back and forth over the net until one of those players outskills another one and hits it just beyond the reach of their opponent. So the professional game of tennis comes down to control, spin, positioning, high levels of skill. Points are usually determined by a matter of centimeters. So very specific. 80% of the points are won in a game of professional tennis. Amateur tennis, kind of different. 80% of the points are lost in amateur tennis. So what that means is the winner isn't usually the person that hits the best shot. The winner is the person that gets the ball over the net lets things just kind of take its course. So in amateur tennis, the winner is actually the one who just makes the fewest mistakes. And so applying this concept again, what Ramo's actually getting at is that he's applying inverted thinking to try to make the ordinary tennis player better and improve their game. Because it's very easy, at least if I ever were to play tennis, I really want to hit the best shot and do amazing, which is great. And then I'm going to lose immediately. What Simon is saying here is that we should actually look to try to reduce the number of mistakes that we make. And just by staying in the game, you can win by default then. Another example, this gentleman here, born in 1929, he passed away a few years ago. He's an American investor, a businessman, philanthropist. He started a massive company and then ran it for a number of years that was an investment firm. His name's Jack Bogle. When he started in the investment services industry in the 60s and 70s, so a little while ago, the really common theme at the time was, we're going to do investment outperformance. We're going to do better than our benchmark and do better than the index, which is great in theory, but it takes a lot of research, which means the fees go up. And the more fees that you pay, the less that you get. So he stood back and kind of thought, well, I don't really want to pay more fees because that's going to cut into things. So what are other things that are kind of taking away from money? What are other ways that can make me more poor? And he came up with the short list. Spending more money than we make, that'll keep you from having money. Not paying high interest debt, not saving enough money early to invest. Those are all things that are kind of somewhat obvious. But he used this concept of inversion thinking, and he came up with an idea that was entirely novel and unique, and he went with the simplest investment possible. And he did that to come up with the very lowest cost he could. So he came up with the saying of, you get what you don't pay for. And essentially, he was just getting at the point where the less you spend on something, the more that you actually have. how that turned out for him is he ended up creating the second largest investment company in the world. So it went okay. Note it, though, he did not create the number one investment company in the world. So for anybody that's competitive out there, the number one investment company in the world took his same philosophy and ideology and then did the same exact thing. So his inversion thinking between these two companies, they end up managing a total of $16 trillion. That's trillion with a T, by the way. That's a big number, pretty big number, all because of the philosophy that he instilled. And so the conventional thinking when he started was, we want to do good investment performance. And he looked and said, I just want to cut down the fees and reduce the costs. And as it relates to an individual's life, we often want to be as rich as we can. But viewed from another angle, can we try to avoid making decisions that can cause us to be poor? Is anybody a nurse here, or in nursing, or medicine? Don't all speak up. Anyway, it's okay. This gal here is Florence Nightingale. So she is the founder of modern nursing, for what it's worth. She was also a statistician and the first woman to be elected into the Royal Statistical Society. Amazing person. So she did a number of things, but when she enlisted in the British Army for nursing in 1854, during the Crimean War, the British Army was suffering a 23% death rate, which is, by every statistic I understand, not good. So that was a bit of a problem. By the way, we only know it's a 23% death rate because of the statistics that she actually charted down. So again, credit to her. It was a really common thinking at the time for lieutenants and generals and high-ranking officials to say, how do we end up winning this war? Not Florence, though. What she did was say, how do we reduce the number of deaths? She's not trying to solve the problem. She's trying to prevent the problem in the first place. And she was able to do that by statistically graphing some charts. By the way, this isn't death by 1,000 charts for the rest of the thing, but I point this out because, one, she came up with a way to visually display information, which is phenomenal. And all the blue indicates preventable deaths. The black and the red indicates unpreventable deaths, so a little more unfortunate. But you can see that's a huge number. And what she figured out was that poor sanitation was the leading cause of death. So that was killing more of the soldiers than the combat itself. So she was able to come up with a system for better sanitary conditions for hospitals and for the soldiers, the way that they were going to be treated. What that ended up doing was it brought down the death rate to 1/10 of what it was before, to about 2.5% in less than 2 years. So what Florence did was save thousands of lives while she was working, but she also had influence on the entire medical industry. And ever since then, has probably saved billions of lives since for the last 168 years. Another example here is a guy by the name of Daniel Kahneman. Has anybody heard of him? There we go. So, Israeli psychologist, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. If that's not connecting yet, economics and psychology, don't worry, it's okay. Anybody even mildly interested in psychology, this book might be worth a read. It is fascinating. He did a number of things, but he thinks that we as humans actually kind of strive for the wrong things. So aiming for happiness, that sounds great, but in his view, we should actually try to reduce suffering and pain. Because if you reduce suffering, you don't guarantee joy in your life, but you do remove the issues that cause pain. And that maybe sounds trivial, but bear in mind, this is a guy with his research partner for 30 years that came up with over 300 different biases and heuristics of human psychology. Again, 300 is a lot. A lot of people base their entire careers on 1 or 2. So one that they're really well known for is the concept of loss aversion. And loss aversion says that we as people have funny brains. Because the way that we process information that's painful is very different from the way that we process pleasure. So for example, when we feel pain from losses, it's about 2 to 2.5 times more significant than the pleasure that we feel from gains. So a quick example, you don't have to do this right now, but when it comes to checking your KiwiSaver balance, yep, here we go. If you see your balance go up from the investments by, say, $1,000, I would assume that anyone in here would be happy. I would also assume if you see that balance go down by $1,000, you're probably going to feel that about 2 to 2.5 times more significantly as pain compared to the gains that you could potentially feel. So again, what we're kind of getting at here is conventional thinking, I want to increase my gains. Inverted thinking is, let's reduce our losses. And the way that Kahneman applies this in a psychological frame of mind is, if you want to increase your happiness, that's understandable, but don't forget about trying to reduce your misery and suffering, because that might be a very worthwhile effort. I want to make sure that there's something that's actually applicable in lives, though, because this is kind of a very fun, abstract idea, but it's sort of like, how the hell can I do anything with this? So here's an idea that you guys can all do tonight, or if you've had too much to drink, maybe tomorrow. Write out a problem, anything that's on your mind, some kind of situation that you've been dwelling on. And then from there, write out a list of things that you would do to fail solving that problem, or a list of things that you could do that would make that problem even worse, exacerbate it. From there, once you have a list of those things, you just want to create a system of how to avoid that going forward. Now again, that's kind of broad because it depends on everybody's situation, but this is a framework that can be used in real life too. So here's an example. If you have a conventional question, let's just, again, broadly say, how do I do better? Better at whatever it is that you're choosing. Invert that question. Turn it around and say, how do I fail to do better? What would actually prevent me from doing that? And the answers, they'll always be different for everybody, but broadly speaking, we might be looking at some common trends. So things like laziness, resentment, self-pity, pretty much all of the behaviors and thought patterns that emotionally and psychologically could be listed as probably unhealthy. If we can avoid that and cut it out from our lives, that's a step in the right direction. Easier said than done, but still something to strive for. The way that this applies in my life and what I do is I work as a financial advisor and planner. If you're not bored yet, just wait. So I spend a lot of time talking with people and thinking with them about their futures. For example, how do they want their lives to go? What kind of things do they actually want to avoid? How do they want to use their money so that they can actually move towards the things that are desirable? And here's kind of a quick thought experiment. Right now, imagine that you are 80 years old. And if you are in your 80s or 90s at this point, do the same. But think back on your life as if you are 80 years old. Did you get to spend it the way that you wanted? Did you do the things and have the experiences that you would have wanted to? Did you find them fulfilling? Imagining your life from the end looking backwards can be a very useful tool in reducing the amount of regret that you can feel in life. Weird, but still helpful. So I end up spending a lot of time talking with people, a lot less about hot stock tips and a lot more about happiness and misery, which are weird concepts when you're talking to someone. So, quick recap here, just to kind of see where we've come from, full circle. This is what inversion can do and has done. It can actually lead to less losses in games, sport, and competition. Great. It can save you money and prevent you from being poorer. It can save lives, it can avoid unhealthy conditions, it can reduce infections and unnecessary death, and it can also help reduce misery and regret. That's a short list. There's probably more than that, but those are probably worthwhile. So I'll leave you with the final thought of, he wins his battles by making no mistakes. And that's all. There'll be no questions. Anyway, thank you. Does anybody actually have questions? Yeah.
As you're going through this, part of it just seemed like I did it before, in some ways, like the thinking, I just wondered, with inversion thinking or psychology, is it a common idea in like other philosophies or knowledges that maybe we don't hear about like all the time, but sometimes do that you think like this, or is this sort of more distinctive?
It can be applied to a lot of different fields. Actually, probably the originator of the idea is a mathematician named Carl Jacobi. And he had a quote that he said, "Invert, always invert." It's kind of vague. That doesn't really apply to anything here super well. But you could, in theory, apply this style of thinking to any field or profession. The idea is it's more of a thing about perspective than it is necessarily related to one field. So whether it is psychology or whether it's about anything else, asking a question that's kind of the opposite of what you're looking for just can help think about things in a different way. Another example might be, I don't know if this is applicable to everybody, but when you solve a maze, some people find it easier to actually start from the end point of a maze and then work their way outwards. That might not be true for everybody, but that's the same kind of thing, where if you have a different starting point and ending point, it can just help you think in one more way. So it's another tool in your toolkit. Does that actually answer your question at all?
Not really. I'm concerned about like, kind of how it might compare to different worldviews or knowledges rather than how it can be applied. So like what are other cultures, like, apart from like maybe Western psychology, which use principles of inversion thinking?
That's a really good question. And the short answer is, I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, good question to be asking though.
So Cam, have you got an example of where you have applied personally inversion thinking to your life?
Yes, but I'm not going to talk about it.
Later. All right. But there are questions later.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay. You know it works.
Cool? Oh, sorry, yeah.
So, Cam, can you apply that? I found that interesting, but quite individualistic.
Yeah.
So can you apply that thinking to economies, to nations, to, if I think about Hugh's talk about rubbish, I join those dots. So
Yeah.
do that. How would you suggest we do that?
A little bit, actually. So Hugh brought it up, which I was pretty happy about. This doesn't really bode well for the idea of inversion thinking, but when he asked specifically the question that came up of what if we didn't need bottles back when production companies were asking that, that was inversion thinking. That outcome didn't work out so well for us, but it is the same kind of idea of putting that kind of application. You could use it in other kinds of examples, but I guess going back to plastics. So let's say you're planning for building out a family and you want to get pregnant. You ask, how do we have a child? Well, you could invert that and then say, how do we avoid getting pregnant? And then consume more plastics. So it's a coy example, but yeah. It would kind of be difficult to... Yeah. It might be difficult to apply it on just kind of a broad spectrum other than kind of citing examples through it, at least in terms of how I can think through that. So, yeah. Yeah.
Is there a danger that applying inversion thinking leads to risk aversion? And if so, how do you manage that?
Yeah, it can lead to risk aversion, but it is one more perspective that's going to be made available to you. Risk aversion, the way that people process risk is different for everyone. But generally speaking, that has to do more with perception of risk and where that's coming from. So the fact that you're inverting a question generally wouldn't change, probably wouldn't make a person more risk averse. It might actually do a little bit of the opposite, because once you understand more of the downsides and how to protect against that, you could potentially feel a little bit more comfortable. And there's some data to support that.